There may be many things with the name Trump plastered on them. Towers, hotels, casinos, and golf courses. And there will be many more. But one thing is unlikely: an American supercarrier named USS Donald J. Trump. But the reason for this is not what you think. We are by no means picking on President Trump. There may not be an aircraft carrier named USS Barack Obama either, especially now that a future carrier has already been named after Doris Miller, a black sailor who heroically saved many lives during the Pearl Harbor attack. I guess that counts as one for the African American community. But who gets to name the US Navy ships? And more importantly, how do they come up with the names? The US Navy, as we know it today, started with only 6 frigates, the construction of which was authorized through the Naval Act of 1794, signed by George Washington. The main reason for this was that American merchant ships were being captured by pirates, and the US government had no means to protect them. In the late 18th and the early 19th century, there were no formal procedures for naming ships. But that changed in 1819, when Congress passed an act stating that all the ships of the Navy of the United States should be named by the Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary has fulfilled this role ever since. But Congress also provides guidelines for naming the ships. For instance, destroyers are typically named after famous naval leaders and distinguished heroes like USS Arleigh Burke, Forrest Sherman, and Zumwalt. Littoral combat ships are usually named for mid-tier cities, small towns, and other U.S. communities, like USS Milwaukee, Cleveland, and St. Louis. Amphibious assault ships are named after important battles like USS Tripoli and Bougainville. The new underway replenishment oilers will be named after people who fought for civil rights and human rights, like USS John Lewis, Harvey Milk, and Earl Warren. And any new frigates would be named after those first 6 frigates from 1794. We'll get to the names shortly. But all this said, the rules for giving certain types of names to certain types of ships have evolved over time. For example, attack submarines were once named for fish, then later for cities, and most recently for states. Cruisers were once named for cities, then for states, and most recently for battles. States' names were once given to battleships, then later to nuclear-powered cruisers and ballistic missile submarines, and most recently to Virginia-class attack submarines. It's also a tradition that upon decommissioning a ship, its name be reassigned to a new ship. For example, as of 2021, the name USS Enterprise had been assigned to 9 different Navy ships, of course not all at once. According to the naming guidelines from Congress, not more than 1 vessel of the Navy may have the same name at any given time. But as you can imagine, there have been deviations from these rules. In fact, the very first deviation goes back to the very first Secretary of the Navy and those 6 frigates. George Washington had asked that the names of those first 6 frigates be inspired by the United States Constitution, and he selected the first 5 names himself: USS United States, Constellation, Constitution, Congress, and President. But the first Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Stoddert, decided to name the 6th ship USS Chesapeake, named after Chesapeake Bay. And deviating from the naming conventions have continued ever since, and in some cases has stirred up controversies by being labeled politically motivated, inappropriate, or disrespectful. And this has mostly been the case when a ship was named after a person. What would it take to name an aircraft carrier after a living former president? Apparently some give and take across the political aisle. The Clinton administration agreed to name an aircraft carrier after the former Republican president Ronald Reagan while Reagan was still alive. But that decision was made only after another carrier was named for Democratic President Harry Truman. What's interesting is that the aircraft carrier that was named after Truman was initially supposed to be called USS United States. Priorities, right? But President Truman had canceled the construction of the very first supercarrier in 1949, just a few days after her keel was laid down. That ship was also named USS United States. So President Truman managed to cancel the name United States not once, but twice. When an aircraft carrier was named after Bush the father, at a time when his son was president, some questioned the influence that the White House may have had on that decision. In addition to that, some raised safety concerns. See, by the time the keel of USS George H.W. Bush was laid down in September of 2003, the United States had already invaded Afghanistan and Iraq under the leadership of George W. Bush. So some feared that the ship's name would make it a target for nations that resented the policies of the younger Bush. On that note, we should mention that aircraft carriers in the U.S. Navy are now generally named in honor of past U.S. presidents. But not every president seems to get their own ship. Even though President Nixon was a Navy veteran, he never got a ship named after him, most likely because of his resignation in the middle of an impeachment in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal. If you look at the presidents after Nixon who don't have a ship named after them, they either didn't serve in the military, that would be President Clinton, Obama, and Trump, or they were extremely unpopular at the end of their term, like the younger President Bush. If naming ships after U.S. presidents are controversial, what do you think of naming a U.S. Navy warship after a foreign national? There have been some instances of this, including an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer named after the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Of course, there were some who opposed the name selection, but Churchill was made an honorary U.S. citizen in 1963. However, the timing of this name selection was questionable, because at the time, the Clinton White House was involved in the Irish peace process, and maybe, just maybe, naming a ship after Churchill would have made things more favorable with the British Parliament. Sometimes names were chosen to compensate for other shortcomings. In 1984, Republican Congressman William J. Coyne from Pennsylvania blasted the Reagan administration for naming an attack submarine for Pittsburgh, calling it a shameless attempt. At the time, the unemployment rate in that area was quite high, and the congressman claimed that the administration had chosen to name the submarine USS Pittsburgh in order to keep the residents' dissatisfaction with the unemployment situation under control. Sometimes the names chosen for the ships were so controversial that they had to be changed after their initial assignment. Captain William F. Calkins was in charge of finding names for ships between 1943 and 1946. One of his challenges was finding new names, according to him, a task easier said than done, to the extent that the National Museum started naming the new fish after submarines, and not the other way around. Let me elaborate. At the time, submarines were named after fish, but with about 500 submarines afloat, under construction, or planned to be built at the peak of the shipbuilding program, there was a shortage of good fish names. So Calkins started naming the submarines after words that sounded fishy, but were not actual fish names. He then worked with an ichthyologist at the National Museum to register those as fish names to be assigned to subspecies of fish that will be discovered in the future. Brilliant, right? But he did run into some complications. When the commanders of those new submarines started asking for a picture of the fish that their submarine was named after. When it came to naming the new escort carriers after bodies of water, Calkins and his team hit a gold mine when they came across the names of some bays in Alaska that no one had previously used for Navy ships: Alikula Bay, Elbor Bay, Ulitka Bay, and so on. But while those ships were still under construction, they had to burnish the names in a hurry. And that's because it was later brought to Captain Calkin's attention, who used to own Alaska before Americans purchased it. Those exotic names chosen for the ships were all Russian. On that note, a number of ships did in fact end up with Russian names, like USS Petrov Bay. I'm no Russian language expert, but Pietrov is pretty damn Russian. Name selections can piss off not only politicians, but religious groups too. Los Angeles-class attack submarines are named after U.S. cities. For example, USS Boston, Dallas, and Memphis, to name a few. But one of the subs in the class is named USS City of Corpus Christi, so it's clear that the name is referring to the city of Corpus Christi, and not the body of Christ, which is what Corpus Christi means in Latin. The addition of the word city to the name was done by the U.S. Navy after religious groups protested that a war machine cannot bear the body of Christ as its name. By now, it should be evident that there has been ongoing tensions between Orthodox traditionalists who believe that Navy ship names should remain faithful to the naming conventions and pragmatic traditionalists who see the Orthodox traditionalists as too strict. The attempts to create and follow a rigid system have failed, probably because most Navy secretaries have been of the pragmatic group. It probably shouldn't be the case that a 3-ship class of attack submarines are named Seawolf, Connecticut, and Jimmy Carter, named for a fish, a state, and a president. So to be fair, maybe some rigidity is required. It seems safe to say that the process of ship naming will continue to evolve as it previously has. The fleet and technologies are changing, so the names would change also. According to a July 2012 report to Congress, one could almost argue that the exceptions made when naming ships after presidents or members of Congress have occurred frequently enough that rather than being considered exceptions, they are a special cross-type naming convention. Ever since the naming of those first 6 frigates of the U.S. Navy, there have been tensions between Orthodox and pragmatic traditionalists. But what can you expect when one of U.S. Navy's oldest ship naming traditions is the Secretary of the Navy's discretion to break the rules? A big thank you to all our supporters on Patreon, both Icebreakers and Boneyards. We really appreciate it.